So thank you everyone for the introductions and all the good things that you brought to this class. Um, as discussed, as I've presented in the brief note about this course, what we're going to go through this semester is not going to be only a development theory review. We're not going to do that. We're going to go through with a specific lens of learning through development theories. So I would give a very brief introduction to the main concepts that we're going to be using in this course, and I expect you to get using these ideas, appreciate what they're looking to and understand what they're trying to say, and then try to use them as we're doing our discussions in the coming sessions of the course. So, and definitely this is not going to be a very strict need to come over to do this in this session, but you will gradually get to what I'm trying to talk about. So this is not a big lecture, it's just a very brief introduction to what we're going to do, but at the end I expect you to understand the need for theorizing development as a process of learning. I would then review this, and I would expect you to be able to distinguish between dimensions and levels of learning that we're talking about, and specifically talk about mental models, shared mental models, and then use them to identify these different ways of learning that we're going to talk about, which are reflexive, reflective, and adaptive learning processes at different levels of the individual, the social entity level, and societal levels. So, as we were discussing and you were introducing yourselves, you could see that there were different ways that development could be thought about, and there's a plethora of development concepts that you were all using. So development, post-development, and how you were thinking about development included different things, different concepts, different perspectives that you brought to development theory. But what I'm going to try to do is to put some sort of framework and a structure to how we're going to understand all these different perspectives that are brought into the development theories and development practice. So why learning? Why do I focus on learning? Is that, and we're going to discuss this very much more in the coming sessions of class, but for now you should recognize that learning is important because it both focuses on the intentionality and unintended consequences of the actions of the developers, of the people that are involved in the development process. It brings in both the intentionality and the consequences of the actions that they're doing. It focuses both on the individuals and the emergent structures. It doesn't give focus only on one of them and then build the other one based on one side of this equation. It also gives focus and provides the possibility of change and stability. So you can understand both change and stability in the process of development. But it's more important for me, I would say, that it conceptualizes society as a changing thing. It doesn't see society as something that is stabilized through the lens of a theoretician that is looking into development, but it's actually theorizes what's going on in a society that is developing in a fashion that is changing. It's always changing. Sometimes the change is not that big, so we can say that it's stable, but sometimes it's really changing, and you can have indicators of what the change is about. So historically, we can see theories about learning. This is the other side of the equation. So I'm trying to make this connection between development and learning. So on the other side, which is learning, there are theories about learning that have been mostly cultivated in psychology. They've been working on it. So they start with the behavioral learning ideas, then cognitive learning, which I'll address in the next slide. But then there's constructive learning, which focuses on the processes which learners build their own mental structures when interacting with an environment. So there's an interaction between the person and the environment. And that's where the constructivist perspective to learning comes about. And then there's ideas about social learning, which really give focus about learning happening not only at the individual phase, which the psychologists really focus on, but actually in the social learning processes that are included, and ideas of communities of practice and things like that we will come about to think about. So this is the model that, this basic model is the way that behavioral psychologists came about to say that we could think of the process of learning as an adaptation process. So people design to do something, they implement it, they observe what they've done and what change that has been done on the environment. They assess it, and then based on the assessment, they design something new. But then, this wasn't the only fact about learning that was there. And when cognitive psychologists came about, they introduced the ways that our cognition is going to be important in the process of learning. So how we see things, how we make sense of things were brought into the equation of learning. And it was said that how these shape the way that we learn, how they shape the way that we design, we implement, we observe, and we assess is going to be very important. But the learning could be seen for two different ways. One way is that based on what was our first way of thinking about things. So we had in mind that we would see some processes in the adaptive process of learning and then give a feedback on it as time goes by and action is done. But then you could also think of this process being done only by thinking about it. So the perspectives that we have and how we see the world working could change in two different ways. One is based on change of ideas and the guiding frameworks and routines that we have based on the change that is done in the action that we do. So every few times that we do an action, a process of action, then we can come back and you can see it with this red, the second process, then we have a second loop of learning. So if this is a first loop of learning, then it would complete a second loop of learning happening. But then also, you can imagine people only sitting in their own houses and thinking about how their frameworks are, how they're looking at the world, and change would happen. And then you could have a reflexive learning, which is the black circle that you could see that could be change happening for an individual. So this is all focused on an individual, and you could see that we have adaptive learning, the loop process of designing, implementing, observing, and assessing. Then we have reflective learning, which focuses on the subjective side of what's happening in the mind, not in the world. And then we have reflexive learning, the change of mental models in response to reflection. So what are mental models here? Mental models are the frameworks and routines that we have in practice. We use them in practice when we're doing something. So you can think of when you're designing to do a process of planning, for instance, you might have specific ideas in mind that people are rational maximizers. So because people are rational maximizers, every aspect of the planning process that you would be looking at, you would have that in mind and it would be a guide in your process. But if going through many processes of planning, you find out that no, that's not as much as it is as we think of and we put into practice, that people are profit maximizers, then there would be a change of how we're thinking about people and how they learn, and they're not profit maximizers. So that would be a change in the frameworks and the mental models that we have about people and the process that we're using. So, and I want to make a distinction between theories in use and spouse theories. So theories in use are those theories that you're using. So think of a planning process. A planner might come up and say that, I don't think people are rational maximizers. But what he or she does in action really reflects that in his or her mind, she really considers people to be rational maximizers. The models that it's using, the things that it's doing, would consider that. So I will come to this in our next lecture and describe it more in detail as we go through the process of looking to development theories and then projecting them on this learning perspective. But the other fact that is important to look here is about how people are not living individually in the world. They're living in different groups, different communities of practice, if you will, and we will come up to say what this term exactly means. But people live in these social entities that they are acting in. I'm not talking about specific organizations, specific nations, or societies, but actually the way that people are immersed in their daily lives to do things together. So you can think of an individual And this is the divide that we had between the mind and the world outside and the adaptive learning that was happening. So we have different individuals that are acting together. What happens is that they do something together, and that brings some sort of surplus to what they're doing. It's not only the aggregation of the acts that they're doing, but actually brings about a further relation between them. For this relation that exists between them, we can consider that there's shared mental models between them. So there's shared habits in a group when people are acting together, and they understand that if someone else is doing this, it means that, and I'll do that, the other thing that I'm going to act based on it. So you can see that we can consider there being shared mental models that are, and this is very similar to the way that I was talking about individuals, so I'm making this social entity very similar to the individual to say that there's adaptation happening, there's choices that people are making based on the feedback that they get from the environment, but also there would be a feedback from what they're acting based on it, and when they go through these practices together, they can give feedback to what's happening about their shared mental models, about the habits that exist in that group and how they are making sense of the world. So then we can see that we would have, first of all, shared mental models, which would include processes of identity building and meaning making that are included in when people are doing action together. And the importance of trust and commitment would come about. And you can see that all these ideas that we were talking about, how participation is important, how trust building is important. I think many of you talked about how you would like development to be participatory is included in this process of understanding learning in this way. And then based on this, we could have adaptive social learning, social reflexive learning, and social reflective learning, very similar to the individual ways that we were talking. So adaptation happens for a group when they put their powers together. Think of a cooperative, think of an NGO that people are working together, but we're not going to stick into those specific institutions. We're going to think of social entities. We'll come back to that as we go forward. And then we have social reflexive learning, which is a change in the shared mental models that people have. So based on this, you can see that there would be two different dimensions. There would be the adaptive, reflexive, and reflective dimension, and then there would be an individual social entity that we talked about, and then a societal dimension. The societal dimension is talking about the institutions that have been reified, objectified, and materialized based on the processes of learning that have happened before. So that's another aspect of learning that we can think of, and you can see that based on this 3x3 matrix, we would have 9 different sorts of learning, and we're going to go through these. For instance, about modernization theory, you can think of how modernization theory could be put in one of those cells, which is mostly focused on adaptive learning. We're going to go to this in our next session. And then you can see that what I'm trying to do is to bring all this plethora of words, concepts, and things that we talk about development into a very structured way of thinking about development, to use it to go through the processes of learning that happen in development. I'm done.